Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk Alamein Week. When finally it is upon us all. It's upon James Holland and I, and of course the Panzer Armee. It's the second Battle of Alamein. We've been working our way towards this.
I'm feeling quite tense about it myself. How's it going to play out? What's going to happen?
How will it play out as two essentially mismatched armies face one another? So we've done the Gazala Stakes, the Fall of Tobruk, First Battle of Alamein, Alam Halfa, the American perspective, background, regrouping, why the Orc had to go, why Alex and Monty are the dream team.
The dream team.
And also how absolutely diabolically it's going for Rommel actually.
Yes.
And that we have this thing that the seesaw has plunked firmly down on the Allies' side now. And he can't get the stuff, he can't get the intel. Essentially, Rommel, in a strange way, is high and dry because he's not being given the panzers, the tigers, or whatever he's asked for. He's not the priority, but he is the priority of 8th Army, and that's what we're at. We're at the climactic battle.
We are, and before just to spin it out just a teeny bit longer.
Terrible.
We never really talk about the Italians except to say they're rubbish. And we know that that's not true because there's people in those Italian divisions who are experienced and know what they're about. But I think what you can say is that with their submachine guns, for example, are superb. They have certain guns which are absolutely fine, but they also have a lot of stuff which isn't. Their tanks are kind of under armored, underpowered. A lot of their artillery is sort of an earlier vintage, which is frankly kind of out of date. They've got absolutely nothing like the 25-pounder. They've got anti-tank guns, but nothing on a par with a kind of Pack 40 or something like that. Yeah. And it is absolutely the case that the command is absolutely rotten at the very core, the top. The political system is rotten. The training is rotten. They don't have if Germany is struggling for resources, Italy's problems are even worse. And I think when one looks at accounts of Italians fighting out there at Alamein, it is really interesting. And one of the guys I got to read, whose diary I got to read, was a chap called Giuseppe Santaniello, and he had aspirations to be a lawyer before the war came along. He was from Avellino, which is not very far from Naples. It's where the 82nd land in Operation Avalanche the following year. And he's 22. He's been he's an artilleryman. He's been an officer in the artillery. He's been in Yugoslavia. But he was very interesting about his training because, and the other thing is, of course, is that the Italians tend to they're not like British or Germans where they kind of underplay things. They massively overplay stuff.
Well, no, I mean, the stuff you've got here in the notes, Jim, I think he's being honest and he's expressing it in a...
He says, an inventor of torches could not have dreamed of anything worse.
I love
it. He goes to this...
No, he's talking about the latrines in that instance.
Yeah, he's talking about the latrines, but he's also talking about the whole barracks, the whole system. They're surrounded by thievery. The toilets are a mess. The food is awful. The training's terrible and old-fashioned. They don't learn anything, really. He is joined up originally with high hopes and full of kind of, the Patria and, the whole Mussolini bullshit and all the rest of it. And all of that is completely crushed. He goes, very soon our hopes and dreams crumbled, replaced by the awful reality of having to live in the midst of this filth and surrounded by criminals.
Yeah.
It's not a great start to your army career. It really isn't. And by the time he goes out to North Africa, he's posted as an officer in the 9th Battery of the 21st Artillery Regiment, which is part of the Trento Division. He doesn't really know an awful lot, to be honest. He doesn't know a lot. He's not particularly well trained. He knows how to fire a gun, and that's about it. And when he gets out there, the morale is terrible. And it's doubly worse because Italian rations are even worse than German rations, and they know that their allies in battle think of them as total pieces of shit. I mean, their contempt is incredibly obvious.
Yeah.
And, that's not a good way on which to to function. And the problem is not only are they short of food and of fuel, particularly, they're also they're also particularly short of water, and this is a real problem. And I was reminded, looking back over my my personnel notes that I have for this period, this guy called Tenente Luigi Marchesi, who is in the Folgore division, which is one of the airborne divisions, which is right down at the south, near the Hermaimat feature, opposite the Fighting French, as they're now called. And Marchesi finds one of his men crying, and he's been so thirsty that he's drunk his own urine, and then his throat is swollen up. That is not a good foundation. Again, we're talking about the 3 M's. It's not looking good for
there's
them.
your morale. That's that gone. Yeah, exactly, which makes everything else more difficult. Also, I mean, raw numbers, the Duke forces are something like 195,000 strong, aren't they?
At the front, yeah. At
the front, yeah. I mean teeth here.
Yeah.
And the Axis forces are something like 115,000. So they are outnumbered. The Allies have twice the tanks in raw terms. And
I think a bit more than that. I think Monty has about 1,200 by the time.
And new ones too. So the thing we've talked about that's been seeded all the way through this, 300 Sherman tanks have been diverted and sent. And just as when the Grants arrived, the Duke soldiers, the armoured soldiers, absolutely love the Grant because it's spacious inside compared to British tank, and it's reliable. Because the American tank design, you stow your stuff inside the tank. Or there's room inside the tank. And on a British tank, you have stowage basket, things outside, bins on the outside of the tank, because you're crammed in.
Yeah,
and your stuff goes outside. Whereas the Grant is necessarily a roomy thing with the artillery piece in the sponson and then the cannon in the turret, and but the Shermans are next along, so they've got modern, roomy, reliable, proper firepower, a match for the handful of Panzer IVs, because there aren't very many Panzer IVs.
I mean, you're talking 2 dozen, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the issue actually is anti-tank weapons in the desert, not tanks, but
well, as Tuka says, the preeminent weapon of the desert battlefield is not the tank; it's the anti-tank gun.
Yeah, exactly. More armored cars, aircraft. It's slightly in the Axis favour, but
only on fighters.
On fighters. But what they're not doing is what they've not done is rejigged to a tactical thing with their fighters the way that the Allies have.
Yeah.
So the Desert Air Force necessarily has an advantage in that respect. How are we doing artillery?
Well, that's sort of 908 guns that Monty has, field guns. Most of those are 25-pounders compared to 200. So that's a kind of, 3.7 to 1 advantage, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, a sort of, a 2-to-1 numerical advantage is by most people's reckoning not a decisive advantage in manpower. You'd expect to attack with 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. As we know later on in the war, the Russians are only attacking if they've got a 10-to-1 or even 40-to-1 advantage. So,
well, at Casino, there's an 8-to-1 advantage at one point, isn't it? It doesn't work either. So,
but as we all know, numbers aren't everything, and it's method, which leads us sort of neatly on to kind of what is Monty's plan then? What is his way of doing things?
Well, he wants to crumble the enemy, doesn't he? That's this fantastic Montyism that he's going to crumble the German front until
that's going to be part of the dogfight.
And as long as the chaps are full of binge, everything will be fine.
But he's going to attack in 2 parts, isn't he? He's going to attack in 2 places. So the interesting thing about the way the minefields have worked themselves out is there's millions of them. And it's really interesting because when I first went around there in whenever it was, 2005, 2004, something like that, there were still piles of these mines everywhere. I mean, literally, you went down the kind of, the Springbok track or the Sidi El Rahman track or something like this. You go down them, and there were every so often there'd be piles where the Egyptian army had obviously cleared all this stuff up, and there were just piles of mines. I mean, there were just zillions of them. But there is this. They're generally pretty thick, sort of a couple of miles thick. But then weirdly, what the Axis have done is they've created this finger. So below Alam Halfa, below the Alamein feature, because Alam Halfa actually is firmly in the British lines at this point. So well south of Ruwaiset, there is this finger that extends about 10 miles to the west. And that's like a dividing line. So Monty wants to do a feint attack with 7th Armoured Division, the old school Desert Rats, 13 Corps, which is under Horrocks, who's just come in, one of Monty's men. And they're going to attack through, and that's going to be a sort of a feint. But the main assault is going to be in the north, around the Ruwaiset Mitraille Ridge. So coming south of Ruwaiset, but straight into the Mitraille.
So basically, but through the hands of the clock.
Through the hands of the clock, exactly.
So to come in along the top of the Ruwaiset Ridge and then swing up. In fact, which is the reverse of what the Afrika Korps did, or tried to do in the first Battle of Alamein, isn't it?
Exactly.
They swung through there. So they're going to come up, kind of sort of, and one is going to be pointing. If you're thinking of your clock, one of them is going at 9 o'clock north of the Mitraille Ridge, and the other one is going at sort of 7:30 for the big hand, going across the Mitraille Ridge. And there's going to be a general advance over a 10-mile stretch. But the key of this, of course, is there's all these mines. Most of the mines are anti-tank, not anti-personnel. So infantry can walk over it without too much problem. It's armour that can't. So how do you get around this? Well, you create 2 channels. And each of those channels, through this 10-mile stretch in the north, will each have 3 lanes of 8 yards wide. And each of those 3 lanes will be codenamed Sun, Moon, Star. And you'll know you're in Sun, Moon, and Star because both the lanes will be taped, this 8-yard stretch. And let's face it, 8 yards is not very long. It's about width of a tennis court, something like that. Yeah.
If that. And they'll be taped, and then there'll be little lanterns all the way along the way, made out of tins of fruit. And they'll have stamped in them a sun and a moon and a star, and they'll be lit. And you'll go, oh, I can see a star shining through that one, so that means I'm in the star track.
Yeah.
So you know you're in the right place. And that's how they're going to get through. And what's going to happen is you're going to have this minefield task force.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like a lot of work for the Corps of Royal Engineers. That there's an awful lot. So
Sappers lead first.
Yeah.
With the mine task force, which is going to be from the Corps de Chasse, which is going to be from 10 Corps. It's going to be these motorized infantry and anti-tank gunners. They're going to move forward, lead forward the tanks, and the infantry either side of them are going to push forward. They're going to get through the minefields to an imaginary line called Oxalic, which is between 3 and 5 miles from the start point. And the start line is obviously a decent size before the stretch before the minefield. So the actual minefield itself is probably, 3 miles, and the advance up is 2. So that's the plan. And the bulk of the British armour and the vehicles of 10 Corps will go through these tracks and then burst out. And the infantry are going to have the job of dealing with the enemy infantry. So that the Corps de Chasse, 10 Corps, this all-arms formation, will then be able to deal with the panzers, primarily the panzers of the Afrika Korps.
Yeah.
Although not all the Afrika Korps is up in the north.
Yeah.
So 15th Panzer and 164th Light are in the north, with part of the Trento motorised division.
And 90th Light in reserve as well, aren't they? And then
164th Light. And the 21st Panzer are down below that long 10-mile line of minefield, which is extending on a kind of east-west axis to the west. And that's the plan. But preempting this is obviously going to be a barrage.
Yeah.
And so what you've got your 908 guns, and they're going to be firing along along the front. And the idea is that there will be a 15, 20-minute barrage just before midnight, or just before 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whatever time it is, on the night of the 23rd of October. Once that barrage is over, Then there will be a creeping barrage, which will move forward 100 yards every 3 minutes, behind which the attackers will advance.
Sounds to me like someone was a staff officer in the First World War,
Well,
possibly.
it's all sounding very Western Front, isn't it? Let's face it.
Sounds to me a little like the guy in charge might be bringing some of his old homework with him. Yes, what's clearly, I mean, it's a 5.5 hour shoot, though, isn't it? The fire plan. It's a big shoot they put in,
Yeah,
isn't it?
Yep.
You know, every gun firing something like 600 shells, you know,
Yep.
which is more than 500,000 shells by the time they're done, which is, you know, if you want a simple thing that's a calling card for Allied material dominance at this point, there it is. You know, it's but obviously there are people who criticise the fire plan after the event. But
well, we can maybe come to that in a little bit. maybe we should describe what happens first, and then we can analyse whether it was the right plan.
Well,
but also the RAF, of course, has been doing softening up beforehand, attacking lines of communications, hammering the rear areas, all that kind of stuff, to trying to kind of really hamper Axis supplies coming up, feeding the front, which he does very successfully. Yeah. Our good old friend Tommy Elmhurst, who's the number 2 to Mary Cunningham at the DAF, he writes home to his wife on the evening of the 21st of October, so 2 days before Alamein opens up. He says, if there's anything I have not yet done, it is too late now. And actually, the two, Tommy Elmhurst left a very, very good description of these dinners. So every night they have these dinners, and they now have combined dinners because they've got combined headquarters. And Montgomery is very into introducing topics of conversation to kind of jolly things along. And on the last night, on the 21st of October, the discussion, the topic for discussion is, the young married officer is the curse of the services. Discuss.
Monty, go on being Monty.
And Elmhurst says it's the first time any of us have seen Montgomery really unbend and be very human.
Really?
Yeah, and he was very good because he had all his liaison officers and ADCs would all join him and stuff. I mean, one of those people was a guy I interviewed called Carol Mather, who'd actually tried to join the ski battalion, then ended up in Lay Force, going out with the commandos, then went back into the desert, then joined the SAS, was involved in all those sort of big shoot-ups of airfields in the summer of 1942. And then at the last minute, Monty got hold of him and said, would you come back and be an ADC to me? And he knew him because his Betty, Montgomery's late wife, had been very good friends with Carol Mather's mother. Yeah. And just after Betty had died, Carol Mather, then a 17-year-old, had been sent to Monty's house to kind of keep him company. Yeah. So they knew each other really, really well. Yeah. And Carol Mather was given a jeep and told to just sort of be the liaison man between Monty and all his various corps and divisional head commanders. So he knew every corner of the battlefield, spent the whole time sort of beetling back and forth, left, right, and centre, but was also party to these dinners, these amazing dinners with, de Gangan and his chief of staff and Monty himself and Mary Cunningham and Tommy Elmhurst and all the rest of it. I mean, it must have been a most extraordinary period and what an incredible experience. But
Monty, after all, as a widower, probably did, on reflection, regard the married officer as because he was 100% focused on his job and all that sort of stuff. So the minefields are prized open.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Or at least in theory, an enormous chute goes in.
Yeah, the barrage, the opening barrage is something of and I've been lucky enough to talk to people who witnessed it. I remember talking to Tommy Thompson, who'd actually been a Spitfire pilot, a Hurricane pilot in Malta back in the day. Was now with the Desert Air Force, and he'd been flying. He was in a night fighter squadron. Yeah, and was flying his Hurricane over the battle when it opened up. And he said all you could see was just this long orange ripple all the way down, for 40 miles. And my old friend Giuseppe Sant'Agnello, who was on the Trento in line with the Matarai Ridge, wrote an infinite number of flashing tongues of light intersecting one another and spreading in an immense semicircle which stretched as far as I could see. Then a whispering inferno exploded on top of us. As hard as I tried, I could not get a grip of myself. I mean, who could blame him?
Look, I mean, who can blame him?
And back at Caledon Camp, what does Alex signal to WSC?
Zip.
Yeah. It's happening.
Yeah.
Churchill's very excited.
Well, and up they go, and of
off
course,
they go.
Attacking's really difficult. It's
it's really difficult.
really, really, really difficult.
And my friend Albert Martin, he's part of 10 Corps. He's 7 Motor Brigade. He's part of the minefield task force. And of course, he's walking along these. He's in trucks. He's in Bedford's, kind of moving along this minefield behind the sappers, and they can't see any tins with stars and suns and moons at all.
No, of course not.
The whole thing's just because in that northern part of the battlefield, it's very sandy.
Yeah.
It's
so
really
up comes
sandy
the dust.
Well, you're grinding all that sand into even finer sand, and suddenly it's like chucking talcum powder up in the air or flour or something.
Apart from the gigantic artillery barrage, what warning do Africa Corps? Have they been taking prisoners to find out what's going on?
No, they don't really know. I mean, the interesting thing is that Monty's big into his deception plans, and he's hired Jasper Mascalane, who's this magician, who's an illusionist, to kind of do feints and all the rest of it and put up.
But there is a big full-on deception plan, isn't there?
The deception plan, just up on the coast. Looks like a naval attack.
Yeah, Operation Bertram.
That's right, and they put lots of pipes and fake trucks and stuff, and they do lots of extra tracks down to the south to make it look like there's a huge build-up of forces down there. But the Axis aren't fooled at all, because they don't know the detail, but they know it's coming in the north because they do, and it's obvious.
Well, and what would you
because of prisoners?
And also, what would you do?
And what would you do? So all this
it's all about the road and the railway.
There's people like to write books about Jasper Mascalane and how he changed the course of the war and World War II and all this kind of stuff, and it's just
the
absolute
magician
nonsense.
who won the war.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes that
he conjured up a diversion.
Oh, Jesus Christ, don't.
Yeah. But it has no effect whatsoever.
Yeah, as the acrid stench of cordite wafts across the...
The acrid stench of cordite and the fog of war was in its ascendancy, I think it's fair to say.
So the Axis are kind of caught on the hop. There's also nothing that not much you can do when you're on the receiving end of
they know it's going to come at some point.
Yeah.
And it's a full moon, and, that's suggestive.
Yeah.
And Rommel's away still, so that's also suggestive.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But for the people who are trying to do this, so the Highland Division disappear off, the New Zealanders disappear off into the darkness. Once the barrage dies down, then they're behind this creeping barrage.
Yeah.
Struggling to one of these lanes are my old friends the Sherwood Rangers, and actually it's Stanley Christopherson and his A Squadron of Crusaders who are spearheading this. And one of his Crusaders breaks down before they even reach the start point. And they reach the first enemy minefield at 4 a.m. So this is quite a long way down the line, having passed through the New Zealanders. And eventually they get through. They advance about 200 yards. By this point, it's dawn. And then it's there are the anti-tank guns of the enemy, some of which are kind of, only 50 yards away. Total mayhem, 5 Crusaders knocked out. They still haven't quite sorted out their radio discipline. So they've been trained into how they should be using radio, and they still use their own one. So Sam Garrett, who's one of his troop commanders, shouts out, "Edward, I've been hit twice, tank on fire, I'm evacuating." And Flash Kellett, who is the CEO of the entire regiment, goes, "Get off the bloody air, and your name is King, not Edward." Actually, Sam Garrett's fine. And Christopherson is, imagine, suddenly dawn creeps over the desert. The darkness has gone, and suddenly you realise you're the wrong side of the Mitiria Ridge.
Yeah,
and before you are enemy anti-tank guns. Behind you is a massive traffic jam that you can't do anything about. And he says, it was quite the worst moment of my life. I couldn't go forward, but all the heavy tanks were behind me. So I couldn't go back on account of them and the minefield. We just had to sit there. But the interesting thing is von Thoma doesn't order a counterattack.
Yeah.
because he knows that they haven't got much fuel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he thinks this is not the moment.
Which is fascinating, because it probably, if there is a moment, it's then, isn't it? Because after all, what you have is a Duke army gaining in confidence as this battle runs forward, and a vigorous counterattack then and there might have made, meant another, because there is a change of plan a little later, but might have meant a bigger one sooner. And I think it is fascinating that he misses the moment there. You wonder if Rommel were in town, whether he'd have ordered a counterattack then and there regardless.
You suspect he probably would have done.
Yeah, I think.
And he knows, and von Thoma knows, he's been told that there's a consignment of fuel coming on the 26th.
Yeah. So
he kind of, what do I do? What do I do? And he doesn't. And so the response is not great, but it's also not as heavy as it might be. And the truth is later that morning, the Sherwood Rangers, along with the other leading armoured formations in the southern corridor, do manage to pull behind the Mitrailleuse Ridge. And that's good news, because from there they're kind of, they're protected from direct fire. And our friend Giuseppe Santinello is absolutely right in the firing line, because he is at the end of the Mitrailleuse Ridge. That is where he is with his Trento division. And he says, the battle is filled with the noise of tracks on the move, of machine guns, of armor-piercing rounds, of 88s, everything covered in the dust thrown up by the tanks, like the wake of ships in a sea of sand. Good description, that. I think.
That's very strong.
Very strong.
But the infantry, so the infantry pretty much get to Oxalic, don't they?
Yeah, not quite.
Not quite, but they pretty much...
Yeah, the Aussies do well. The Aussies are in the northern corridor, and they do pretty much get to Oxalic. It's the southern corridor where they've got this sort of, they've got the Mitrailleuse Ridge to kind of deal with, and the Aussies sort of do go forward. The Axis forces have another problem, is that General Stummer, who is the acting commander of the Panzer Army, goes forward in the morning, and he gets out of his command car and shells whistle over. He hurries back in, and as he's getting back in, he suffers a massive heart attack and dies. So that's him. So von Thoma, who is the acting commander of the Afrika Corps, then has to become the acting commander of the Panzer Army. It's not a great start for the Axis, to be fair.
No.
And in the south, 7th Armoured Division they don't even breach the minefield at all. They're really struggling. They do enough to keep 21st Panzer on their toes and the Arietta Division tied down, but nothing more than that. So there's no slipping of 21st Panzer or the Ariete up to the north or anything like that. And in the far south, the Free French don't dislodge the Folgore at all from the Hermaimac.
No. So that's the end of the first day.
Pretty much.
We're going to take a break, and then we're going to try and do the rest of this battle in an episode, but you never know.
Yeah, we'll get it done. We'll get it done.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. The second battle of El Alamein is underway. Well, at least we've done the first day.
Well, so that night, the Aussies who've done the best, they're ordered to sort of attack again that night.
Yeah.
And the 51st Highlanders are also pushing forward. And there's this loads of descriptions of them doing that, behind the guns, the smoke, the sand. You see these figures under the flares, sort of, spectral, disappearing out of view into the clouds of smoke and dust, but playing their bagpipes.
Yes, of course.
And lots of people just say it was the most profoundly haunting sound I ever heard, above the din of the guns and everything. You could hear this sort of reedy. And there is something about the bagpipes, isn't there, that is a little bit haunting.
Well,
they're not everyone's taste.
That's the idea. I mean, they're meant to put the willies up you they're meant to fortify you and put the willies up the other side. But so on the 24th, though.
So this is the night of the 24th.
Yeah.
25th.
Yeah.
So the morning of the 25th.
Yeah.
There hasn't been much progress. Sherwood Rangers are on the go again.
Yeah.
They get stuck again. Get attacked by Stukas. A lot of soft skins are hit. 20 lorries are left blazing. Sappers are still struggling to clear these minefields. And at 3:30 a.m. on the 25th, there's this on the 26th rather, the following day, there's this crisis talk. Only the Aussies seem to be making any progress.
Yeah.
So they try to kind of make all the emphasis on the Aussies front, and they capture a key feature called Point 29, which tells you just how low all this is. I mean, that's 9 meters above sea level. It's nothing. Feet are above sea level, rather. And there is this feeling that it's sort of going absolutely nowhere. And, so it's the morning of the 26th, Monday the 26th of October, at the TAC HQ, which is at Burg Al Arab, which is a little bit further back.
Yeah.
Monty's in a bit of a pickle because the crumbling hasn't really got underway. There's certainly no breakout. It's all just bogging down. It's all a bit stuck. Now, he said it was going to take 10 days to do this battle. So there's no... It's crisis talk in so much that they've woken up Monty in the middle of the night to talk about it.
Which is absolutely... that's a tro, isn't it? Because he likes to go to bed and be wake up in the morning, so he's fresh. You don't go and go, excuse me, sir. You don't do that.
There is a sense of this isn't quite working. Do we need a plan B?
Yeah.
They've lost 300 tanks knocked out so far out of 1,200.
Yeah.
Which actually isn't as bad as it sounds because most of those are recoverable. Most of those are kind of, tracks come off or engine room damage. They're not all kind of smouldering wrecks. But I do think it kind of, I think this is the point where one discusses, could there have been another way of doing this? Was Monty right? I think, it's interesting looking at what Tuka says about all this.
Yeah.
Because Tuka thinks there was another way.
Yeah.
And his first point is he thinks, there should have been, he was in favour of a much stronger second thrust down below the Ruwaisa Ridge, which is south of the Mitterrand Ridge, and south of that long finger of minefields that extends 10 miles. So his view is that what you could do is push into there,
go as far around the bottom as you can, scoop round, come round under the Folgori, through the 17th Pavia, and come up and clock the Ariete on your way through, right?
Exactly that. And his big point about this is that the problem is the minefield. When you've got that level of overwhelming force, fundamentally you haven't really got an issue. You are going to win. But all your advantages are completely stifled by the minefields. Yeah. So once you get out of that, sheer weight of numbers will ensure that you can't possibly lose. And I suspect he's probably right. But his biggest gripe is the use of the guns.
Yes, he thinks the fire plan isn't concentrated enough and is just basically too sort of vague, doesn't it? Is how he sees it.
Well, it's just too First World War. I mean, it just is. Yeah. So you've got 900 guns. You've got 400 in the northern thrust because you've got these guns spaced equally all the way along the length of the line. But that means you've got more than 50%. You've got 500 which aren't in the main thrust. And you've got 300 which are being used in the thrust for 13 core, which gets absolutely nowhere and which fools nobody. Yeah. So wouldn't it have been better? So what that means is you've got one gun per 45 yards. Yeah. And he suggests that actually a better option might have been to have 150 guns on the rest of the line and say 700 or 750 over a 5-mile stretch firing in concentrations. And what he means by that is instead of each gun firing straight in front of it, that you have 750 guns firing over an area of 1,000 yards. Yeah. And then you move on to the next 1,000 yards. And then you move the next 1,000 yards.
But I think a lot of this is to do with, it's the thing we talked about in the last episode, is Monty's trying to do things within what he knows Eighth Army is actually capable of, rather than trying to cook up things that in an ideal world they'd be able to do. And my feeling with Tuka is because he's an Indian Army man and he's got one of the sort of front line, front end bits of the Indian Army in the form of the 4th Indian Division, who've been raised as professionals and all that. I think he's used to working with people who I'm not going to say more competent, but have their act together a little bit more than some of the, some of the civilian bits of the British Army. And I think maybe a month later, you'd have been able to do this with the gunners with that extra bit of training, with extra bit of coordination. But this is what a big part of how Monty fights the Eighth Army, but fights with Eighth Army at Alamein. He's saying, "I'm going to fight with us as we are." Half a loaf is better than, the whole loaf and all that sort of stuff. And what we're going to do is use the army within its capabilities rather than completely shake up and reorganize. Because I think it's interesting that the Corps de Chasse, 10 Corps is the extent of his sort of
radicalization.
Rebadging, reorganization, centered around, a fresh way of doing things. He doesn't apply it to the entire army because I think he knows.
No, that's true. But I would have also say, how hard is it to fire a concentration? I mean,
well, I don't know. I don't know
even if it's 600 guns firing on concentrations, the idea that you fire in a box. And then you move to the next box. I know. But obviously, that's going to chew things up a lot more effectively.
But organisationally, is the Corps of Artillery there yet? And so what you do is you do a thing you can pull off, so that you pull it off, so that because let's say you do try these sort of fire concentrations and it doesn't work, everyone's going to go, it was your bright new bloody idea that went wrong for us.
Well, except, and we haven't got to Supercharge yet. That's exactly what he does at Supercharge.
I know, which is obviously so maybe that's also Monty thinking, well, all right, then we're going to have to get our finger out now, and that maybe he's underestimated. He's because there is an element, of course, of one of the problems with playing safe like this, which is what he's essentially doing, isn't it? Is that you might underestimate actually what people are capable of delivering to an extent, especially if their morale is on the uptick, which it is at this point. It's coming up. The morale has been coming up in the run up to this battle. Because the training's good, because they're engaged with their commanders and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just sort of.
And there aren't any, but for example, there aren't any 3.7 inch, which I guess again is a continuation of what you're saying. That's just kind of a thought too many, perhaps. But there are 200 that aren't needed in the Delta.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know. But then, just look back to July. What flat people got into. In the Delta, and maybe you don't want to. If you start taking anti-aircraft guns away from there, you might generate another one. I mean,
what is interesting is generally speaking, he's concentrating his forces. So he pulls 7th Armoured out of the southern bit. Yeah, he pulls out New Zealand Division. Yeah, the Aussies are ordered to continue their drive. They're not happy because it's kind of 4th night in a row, 3rd night in a row. This then is potentially going to leave a gap for the 50th, where the 51st Highland were. So they're ordered to shift up. The South Africans, who haven't been part of the battle, are then moved into the line where the 51st Highlanders and the New Zealanders were. And Tuker's 4th Indian are then given a kind of a longer stretch. Yeah. Further down to the south. So the orders are that they would complete those manoeuvres by the 28th. So up until the 28th, there's going to be the grinding battle. They're just going to keep going, just grinding their way. Desert Air Force, RAF, coming over every, all the time, 24/7. Pounding enemy lines and just seeing where they get to. But there is a recognition that there is going to need to be a phase 2 even at this stage. Yeah. Meanwhile, Hitler has rung up Rommel, who is in a sanatorium recovering from ill health, and said, this is what's happened. Rommel checks out of the sanatorium, hotspots it back to the desert, is there by the evening of the 25th. Immediately orders a counterattack. And von Thoma already says, well, actually, I have finally committed 15th Panzer. They've been sort of counterattacking all day. But they're then due to be massing again. By the time Rommel gets back, they're going to mass again for a concentrated effort on the 27th of October. And this is going to be the first main coordinated counterattack.
And this is all around a place known as Kidney Ridge, isn't it?
Yeah, so at the same time, the 7th Motor Brigade and the 2nd, which is the King's Royal Rifle Corps and the 2 Rifle Brigade, have been pulled out of the minefield task force, and they're now back in their role as principally as anti-tank gunners, and they're told to move forward, which is through the southern corridor, to this area, which is sort of towards the Pearson line, which is the next sort of major line, and a feature called the Kidney Ridge.
Yeah.
Which isn't a ridge at all. It's actually a little... Well, it's a
of
ridge
hillock.
because between it are two very, very, very shallow hollows. And when I'm talking about shallow hollows, they're so shallow you can barely notice you're in them. One of which is codenamed Snipe, and the other one is codenamed Woodcock.
Yeah.
And the Rifle Brigade get into Snipe position with their six-pounders by dawn on the 27th of October. And when the sun rises up and they, behind them and lights up the desert, what they realize is that they're in the major assembly area for where the panzers are going to be doing their counterattack.
Yeah.
And they suddenly think, yikes. And they've been assured that 2 armoured brigades from 1st Armoured Division are going to come to their support. And they do tentatively come to support. 7 Sherman tanks probably get brewed up. And then they pull back. And the reason why the armoured brigades don't go full force is because they know that supercharge, the next phase of the battle, is just around the corner, and they need to kind of sort of keep certain powder dry. So suddenly, 2nd Rifle Brigade, much more so than the King's Royal Rifle Corps at Woodcock, which is only kind of, a mile away, suddenly find themselves completely isolated.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a catastrophe for Rommel and his panzer corps, because suddenly you've got this screen of anti-tank guns who are blocking your advance. And, a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, 1,000 yards is no problem at all. And, and over the course of the day, they managed to destroy over 50 vehicles, and something like 37 tanks. When you've only got 200 tanks in the first place and you've already had some attrition already, that's kind of a third to 50% of your tanks force just gone just like that in one day's action.
Yeah.
That's really, really bad news. That is effectively 15 Panzer gone as an effective fighting force.
So in effect, obviously there's been some luck of the draw here, but by prompting the Germans essentially to counterattack, and by the Germans, although the Germans delaying in choosing to counterattack, they've actually that is like a perfectly sprung trap. Actually,
yes.
I mean, it's
of course, it doesn't seem that way if you're a member of the Rifle Brigade.
No, of course, absolutely no, it doesn't one bit. But it is interesting that what you've got there is really the way things are going to end up going eventually. Which is what you do is you attack the enemy in order to provoke him into counterattacking, and then you destroy him in the counterattack, and
which is exactly what the Germans have been doing for years. That's how they destroy 1st Armoured Division. It's just that we're seeing it from the perspective of the anti-tank gunners rather than from the German perspective. And from the anti-tank gunners, it's like, holy moly, we're right in the crossfire here. This is not what we bargained for. Yeah. Oh, my God. And, casualties are falling. I mean, the 2 Rifle Brigade lose 72 casualties that day, which I would say, actually, out of a whole battalion is kind of not a lot in the big scheme of things for such an intense engagement. And the number of deaths are, third of that, quarter of that, I don't know. But they're not huge in the big scheme of things. They run out of ammunition by dusk, and they're kind of holding on there. They're thinking, well, we can't pull out until night falls. But as we all know, in the desert, night falls very quickly. They're expecting the armour to come up and take over their positions. They don't. So eventually they just go, okay, right, we're going to pull out anyway at 10:30 at night. So they pull back at 10:30 at night. Yeah. They're all absolutely spent. I mean, there's carriers have been knocked out. There's been these sort of, countless acts of unbelievable heroism. But around the desert are these kind of, 30 plus tanks, which are kind of brewing and smouldering and blackened. Little sort of pinpricks of smoke rising up into the sky. There's all these sort of, shot up ammunition lorries and all the rest of it. I mean, it's been an amazing day for the Rifle Brigade and indeed for the whole of 8th Army and for Monty's attack in the north. And it's absolutely put the brakes on the major counterattack. Yeah. I mean, it's a catastrophe for Rommel. I mean, Albert Martin, my old friend, I mean, he's really interesting. I mean, he says, is it possible to put into words the emotions of soldiers who have now reached safety after long hours when death or crippling could happen at any second during those interminable hours? The usual words of pleasure, relief, happiness, thankfulness are all totally inappropriate. Substitute bewilderment, incomprehension, drained, numbed, or disbelief. I mean, you can imagine, can't you? They're just absolutely phased out. But what that day prompts a pause. Rommel's spent He's got to think about what he's going to do with his 164th Light Division. He's got to wonder whether any more ships are going to come in and whether he's going to get any more supplies up. While Monty's got to kind of completely reorganize everything. They consolidate the gains they've made. They're basically through the bulk of the minefields now. They're holding those positions tenaciously. The Aussies are through. They're fighting around a series of low buildings, which are just north of the railway track, and up in that sort of near Tel El Isa, up round there, up towards the coast. And it's reorganize your troops, think of plan B, and then do another major coordinated assault. Yeah. And that's going to be called Supercharge. Part 1 had been Lightfoot. This is now Supercharge.
And 7th Armoured are redirected, aren't they, from the south, where they've been involved in the Free French battle around the Munasib Depression and against the Folgori. So they're redirected completely.
They are, but it's still going to be 10 Corps who are going to lead Supercharge.
Yeah. But it's very interesting that Monty feels he can handle 8th Army to the point where it's a relatively small battlefield in this respect, isn't it? I mean,
that northern bit, yeah.
That northern bit. So he's redirecting at will, which I think is pretty interesting. It's sort of miles away from what sort of piecemeal stuff that 8th Army have done before. This is okay.
This is this is right. Hold what you've got.
Yeah.
But let's reorganize our reserves, pull back certain units, and let's reorganize and launch a major proper offensive. And he plans to launch it on a much smaller punch, a single punch, 3 miles rather than 10, concentrated artillery, firing in concentrations as we discussed earlier on. Yeah. And the plan is to exploit the success of the Australians and attack through that very, very northern corridor. The only thing is that Alexander has ultra clearance and has picked up that the 164th Light Division is going to be counterattacking through there. That's Rommel's plan on the 2nd of November.
Yeah.
And so he quietly has a word with de Gangan and says, I think it might be a good idea for you to suggest to Monty that it might be much better to attack, through the Mitraya region rather than north of that. Do you hear what I'm saying? And de Gangan goes, yes, absolutely got it, Chief.
Yeah.
And de Gangan says, I wonder whether it might be a good idea to do this. What do you think? And so sort of planting the idea in Monty's mind, and Monty goes with it and then takes all the claim on him.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What that means is on Monday, the 2nd of November, at 1:05 a.m., the Supercharge barrage begins, and this time it really is concentrated force. And they haven't got as far to go through the minefield this time, so it's just the challenge is much depleted.
Yep.
As are the Axis forces by this stage, who've just been attrited. So to a certain extent, the crumbling, the dogfight that Monty calls it, has worked because it's unquestionably ground down. I mean, 15 Panzer basically doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
21st Panzer is still stuck in the south. 164th Light is about to be engaged. But suddenly this huge weight of force, and this is a proper Schwerpunkt.
Yeah.
Concentration of force on this thing in a way that it hasn't been at Lightfoot.
Yeah.
At the start of the Alamein battle. And the game is up, basically. That as night disappears and dawn rises over the battlefield, it's kind of all over. And one of the I remember lots of people have noticed there was this sort of crossroad of tracks in the minefield where there's this dead German. And people like Karel Mather, who are kind of sort of, an ADC who's beetling about from one kind of unit to another. Every day he's passing past this dead German. And every day it gets more and more covered in dust, so that it's, by this stage, it's just this white spectral figure, as though it's been sort of sack of flour dolloped over it. And it's kind of, again, sort of symbolic of the fate of the Axis forces and the Afrika Corps. And they get through, and on that evening of the 2nd, his second counterattack is, it's non-starter before it's even started. 164th Light, forget it, it's not going to happen. there's a general disengagement. And actually, Rommel really wants freedom of movement, and he thinks there's no way I can just send a signal, knowing Hitler as I do. I need to send someone over there. So he sends one of his junior officers, a chap called Lieutenant Berndt, to go and fly to Hitler's headquarters and go and speak to him in person and tell him face to face that he wants what Rommel needs is freedom of action at this point.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, overnight, by the following morning, von Thoma and Beerlein, who was the chief of staff of the Fritz Beerlein, the chief of staff of the Afrika Korps, report that they've only got 30 panzers left by this point.
Yeah.
And the Brits are already at Tel Akakir. And Tel Akakir is this kind of trig point on the map, which is beyond the Sidi El Rahman track. And that's very much the kind of, by that point, by the time you get into the Sidi El Rahman track, you kind of, you're 10 miles from where they started. And the Sidi El Rahman track, the Rahman track runs at kind of, if you're thinking about a clock face, it runs at sort of 7 o'clock. So in a kind of sort of north to south westerly direction. But it's kind of north-south.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. Or rather, south-southwest.
Yeah.
That's probably the right way to do it. And they've got past there, and past that, you're well clear of the minefields. And that weight of armor which still exists, that kind of, 500, 600 tanks that they can still call upon, that's an overwhelming number, when you're against 37 or 30 or whatever. There are no answers left. And then the report comes back at midday from Hitler. And it's not quite what everyone was hoping, it's fair to say. And Hitler says, in the situation in which you now find yourself, there can be no other consideration save that of holding fast, of not retreating one step, of throwing every gun and every man into the battle. Despite his numerical superiority, the enemy too will reach the end of his resources. It would not be the first time in history that the stronger will has prevailed against the stronger battalions of the enemy. You can show your troops no other way than that which leads to victory or to death.
Shut up your face. I mean, honestly.
And as you can imagine, that's not really what they want to hear. But it's too late.
Well,
the bottom line is it's too late. They're on the way. And, our friend Giuseppe Santaniello goes, all is chaos and confusion. Nothing is clear. From time to time we stop. Lorry follows lorry in a cloud of thick black dust. And by the following day, the 4th Indians are on the charge, Chika's mob. They're well beyond the Sidi Rahman track. And at 11 a.m., Beerlein's just been talking to von Thoma, and he goes, right, it's time to go. And he pulls out, and he's just getting back into his truck where he sees kind of 500 yards away, he can see von Thoma suddenly becomes surrounded, and he sees these Tommies with their tin helmets coming towards them, and von Thoma standing there with that kind of rather cool kind of baseball cap kind of thing that the Afrika Korps had, and his goggles on, and a canvas satchel over his shoulder. And he sees the Tommies getting him, and von Thoma holding, putting his hands up, and he's been surrendered. And no sooner does that happen than suddenly this bursting across the vetch through the desert is this kind of sort of massive armor and half tracks, and not half tracks, but armor and carriers and whatnot. And he just thinks, that's it. It's literally the kind of force of 8th Army just sweeping towards him. And so Beerlein at that point just sort of hurries off and disappears off into safety.
Does von Thoma have to have dinner with Montgomery? Am I right in thinking that?
He has to have dinner.
Poor sod.
Yeah. Where Montgomery tells him what he got all wrong.
Yeah. What's interesting is that
and the battle's over.
The battle is over. Then there's a sort of boring debate about whether 8th Army.
I'm firmly with Monty on this, by the way.
Pursue Rommel hard enough, and we go back to the point we keep making in this, is that Montgomery is being very, very careful with 8th Army. He is being cautious, and the reason about what he gives it to do. And the reason for that is because previously it's been given stuff to do it's incapable of, and he knows that the surest way to wreck an army is to have its reach exceed its grasp, essentially. And so he's thinking, well, we've got that right. We'll take our time. We'll learn our lessons. There's torches happening.
And we'll retreat off. They're toast. They can't recover from this. We'll just go after them.
Torches happening anyway. We'll pursue them at our leisure. And it's very.
The bottom line is They do, and they're incredibly successful at it.
Yes, I know. And the bottom line is they do, and they're incredibly successful at it. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, what's interesting, though, is Monty says the moral effect of air action is very great and out of all proportion to the material damage inflicted. And this becomes, the great leitmotif of the Allied way of war, actually, really after the desert. In the reverse direction, the sight and sound of our own air forces operating against the enemy have an equally satisfactory effect on our troops. A combination of the two has a profound influence on the most important single factor in war, morale. And there it is.
There you go.
And the
single most important factor in war.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? And
you simply cannot argue with that.
No. And then of course Churchill gets to say, it may almost be said, before Alamein we never victory, after Alamein we never defeat. And the almost is sort of load bearing there, carries a great deal of weight, the almost in that, but it's essentially right. And I think what's so interesting about this battle is obviously all the sine waves in the Allied progress to effort all arc at the same point for this battle. They all coincide. It's like when you see in my line of work, when you see a comedian finally figure out how to write and perform at the same time, that the two things coincide with each other and the audience get the joke. It's that moment where however when you put it, the planets align, the ducks are in a row.
Yeah.
And from then on, it's not just that the lessons have been learned, but the effect upon morale within Eighth Army, that they are the people who win this first colossal blow. And I know Montgomery has to change his plan, but basically you have the two sort of features of the Montgomery way of doing things. You've got crumbling and a colossal crack, which is what this battle boils down to. Lightfoot's the crumbling. Supercharge is the colossal
Supercharge
crack.
You can't fault. Supercharge is brilliantly planned, brilliantly executed. And one of the reasons it's brilliantly executed is, of course, because they haven't got this huge, massive, great depth of minefield to get through anymore.
Yeah.
And they haven't got the weight of numbers on the other side even when they get there.
Yeah.
And they've also got growing confidence. There is this feeling that, which is obviously tied into morale, but there is this feeling that
it's working.
That is working, that we've got this, we are now on the cusp of a great victory.
Yeah.
This is a British-led victory, Commonwealth Duke forces crushing an Axis army in the field for the first time in the war.
Yeah. And
that's a big thing. And obviously, compared to you can't get into this kind of, but compared to the numbers Eastern Front, it's not like that. It's about numbers. You cannot conflate numbers with strategic importance.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if this is the British doing it their way, where what you do is you fight the opponent somewhere that's inconvenient for him to fight you,
and on your terms.
So the German material expenditure to run the Panzerarmee is far in excess of what it would cost to run that sized army in Europe, because you've got that much further to supply it. You've got that much more effort, fuel to supply it, stuff to get ships, the whole thing. Yep. If you look at it in terms of fuel, steel, and embuggerance, the place you want to defeat the Germans is in North Africa, if you're the British.
Well, you know what we should do? Next May, we should do a Tunisia week.
All right. Okay. Well,
then we can continue this epic saga.
Well, we've got to the end of. We've actually managed to get to the end of.
Yeah, 6 hours later.
So, John.
6 hours of desert war.
Well, if we haven't
I've enjoyed it enormously.
If we haven't shaken the listeners off by now, we
need to end with something also rather special.
Whatever, we haven't ever shaken them off with this thing, we never will. It's I think the way I'd put it.
Yeah, that's one way of doing it.
I mean, I was
going to say, we still got your little treat at the end.
So I have a poem by John Jarmain, who was in the 61st Anti-Tank Regiment Royal Artillery, attached to the 51st Highland Division. And so he fought at El Alamein, and then in Sicily, and then he was killed in Normandy. And he's buried in the 6th Airborne Cemetery at Ronville. Killed on the 26th of June while driving down to inspect his troops at dawn. But he wrote this poem about El Alamein. There are flowers now, they say, at El Alamein. Yes, flowers in the minefields now. So those that come to view that vacant scene, where death remains and agony has been, will find the lilies growing, flowers and nothing that we know. So they rang the bells for us and Alamein, bells which we could not hear. And to those that heard the bells, what could it mean? The name of loss and pride, El Alamein. Not the murk and harm of war, but their hope, their own warm prayer. It will become a staid historic name, that crazy sea of sand. Like Troy or Agincourt, its single fame will be the garland for our brow, our claim. On us a fleck of glory to the end, and there our dead will keep their holy ground. But this is not the place that we recall, the crowded desert crossed with foaming tracks, the one blotched building lacking half a wall, the grey-faced men, sand powdered over all, the tanks, the guns, the trucks, the black, dark smoking wrecks. So be it. None but us has known that land. El Alamein will still be only ours. And those 10 days of chaos in the sand, others will come who cannot understand. Will halt beside the rusty minefield wires and find there flowers.
Very good.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Let the church bells ring throughout the realm.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.